You learn, as you get older, that some of the most important moments in your life don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with a thunderclap or a flash of lightning. They come in quietly, dressed in the ordinary, and sit down at the table with you. They unfold in the space between the clinking of a fork against a plate and the polite murmur of a crowded room. My moment came on a Tuesday, 72 stories above the glittering heart of New York City. My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed. It's a title I haven't used for myself in nearly 2 decades, a ghost from a life I packed away in a box, much like my old research papers. For the past 20 years, I've simply been mom, a role I thought was my greatest work, my most profound experiment. That night, I learned that experiments can fail spectacularly. The restaurant was called The Summit. It was the kind of place where the air itself seemed to cost money, thin and crisp and smelling of success. From our table by the window, the city sprawled below like a spilled jeweler's box, a million tiny diamonds scattered on black velvet. I felt like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a chandelier, out of place, my feathers a little too worn for all the glitter. My dress was a simple navy sheath, the one I saved for special occasions. It was 10 years old, but it was elegant, or at least I had thought it was, until I saw my children, Mason and Olivia, my beautiful, brilliant children. They didn't just belong here, they were part of the gleam. Mason, in a tailored Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my first car, had the sharp, restless energy of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. Olivia, beside him in a silk dress the color of champagne, was radiant. She had her father's smile, but tonight, it seemed less like a warmth and more like a beautifully polished shield. "Isn't this incredible, Mom?" Olivia said, gesturing to the view with a perfectly manicured hand. "We wanted to celebrate somewhere special." "It's breathtaking, honey," I managed, my voice feeling small in the vast, humming space. An undercurrent of tension flowed beneath their smiles, a quiet hum I couldn't quite place, but one a mother always feels. It's a vibration in the air, a frequency tuned only to your heart. The waiter, a young man who moved with silent, practiced grace, poured champagne. We raised our glasses. "To Aura Health," Mason announced, his voice ringing with a conqueror's pride. "And to the future." We drank. The bubbles tickled my nose. For a moment, everything was perfect. After the appetizers, tiny, exquisite creations that looked more like art than food, Mason leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the white tablecloth. The stage was set. "Mom," he began, a rare, wide smile spreading across his face. "The big news, the reason we're here. On Friday, we're signing the final papers. Aura Health is being acquired by North Star Pharmaceuticals." He paused for effect. "The deal is for $200 million. The number hung in the air, so immense it felt unreal. 200 million. I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes, a hot rush of pride and relief so powerful it made my head spin. It had worked, all of it. The gamble, the sacrifice, the blind faith, it had all paid off. My mind flew backwards, not in years, but in heartbeats. I saw myself standing in the empty living room of my parents' home, the one they'd left to me, handing the keys to a realtor. I felt the hollow ache of withdrawing my entire retirement fund, the numbers on the screen shrinking to zero. I remembered the late nights, brewing coffee for Mason as he hunched over his laptop, his dream a fragile, flickering candle I shielded with my own 2 hands. Nearly $1 million. My entire financial past and future poured into his vision. It was a deal made not on paper, but in the silent language of a mother's love, an investment secured by nothing more than a promise and a hug. "Mason, that's wonderful." I finally choked out, my hand flying to my chest. "Oh, honey, I am so proud of you, of both of you." Mason beamed, Olivia smiled, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She took a delicate sip of water, glanced at Mason, and then turned to me. The shift was so subtle, it was like a cloud passing in front of the sun. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "With this big change, we've been reviewing all the financials, and the apartment you're in is a little costly." I blinked, the celebratory haze in my mind starting to clear. "The apartment?" Mason picked up the thread, his tone shifting from celebratory to clinical, the voice he used for business. "We've found a very nice senior community for you just outside the city. In New Jersey. It's safe, quiet, and more importantly, more cost-effective. As we finalize the acquisition, we need to streamline all non-essential expenses. The words hit me one by one, like cold, hard stones. Senior community, New Jersey, cost-effective, non-essential expenses. The room seemed to tilt. The glittering city lights blurred into a meaningless smear. Cut expenses? I whispered, my voice trembling. But what about my share, my investment in the company? I was your first investor, Mason. Mason let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a sound of humor. It was the sound of a lock clicking shut. Mom, come on, he said, a patronizing edge to his voice. That was money you gave me. It was a gift. There was no paperwork, no contract. You don't understand how these things work. He leaned back, spreading his hands as if explaining a simple, obvious truth. Think of this as us taking care of you, setting you up somewhere practical. We just know what's best for you, Olivia added, her voice dripping with a false, pitying sweetness that was more painful than any insult. You won't have to worry about a thing. And there it was, the truth. They weren't just my children anymore, they were executives, and in their cold corporate calculus, I had been reevaluated. I was no longer a mother, a supporter, a co-creator of their dream. I was a line item, a liability, an asset to be managed and relocated. This magnificent dinner wasn't a celebration of our shared success. It was a severance package, an eviction notice served with champagne and truffled risotto. I sat there, 72 stories in the air, surrounded by wealth and beauty, and felt my heart shatter. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet, internal collapse like a bridge giving way in the fog. I had sacrificed a career I loved, a future I had earned all for them, and in the end, I had my answer. I wasn't their foundation. I was just an unnecessary expense. The taxi ride home was a silent film played out against a pane of glass. The city's brilliant, chaotic energy, which had seemed so full of promise just an hour before, now felt like a mockery. Each lit window in the towering skyscrapers was a life, a story, a family. I wondered how many of them were sitting around a table, dismantling a mother's heart with the cool precision of a surgeon. The driver didn't speak, for which I was grateful. Silence was the only language that made sense. Words were what had broken me. I had no appetite for more of them. The apartment greeted me with a blast of cold, conditioned air. It was a beautiful space, a corner unit in a glass tower in the West Village, chosen by Olivia for its clean lines and good light. It had 3 rooms, all painted a stark, gallery white. It was less a home and more a minimalist display case, and I was the single, aging exhibit they had placed inside. Now, they were simply moving the exhibit to a less expensive gallery. I walked through the living room, my heels clicking softly on the polished concrete floors. My children's taste was everywhere. A low-slung Italian sofa in a shade of gray that was neither warm nor cool. A single, dramatic orchid on a chrome side table. A large, abstract painting on the wall that was just a swirl of angry black lines. They had furnished the space for me, a generous act on the surface. But in truth, they had built a set, and I was merely the actress hired to play the part of the well-kept mother. My reflection stared back at me from the dark glass of the floor-to-ceiling window. A woman with tired eyes and a dress that suddenly felt a decade out of style. Was that me? Dr. Evelyn Reed, who once commanded a research lab? Or was it just Mason and Olivia's mother, a title that had just been unceremoniously revoked? I wandered into the small study they had designated for me. A sleek, white desk faced a wall of built-in bookshelves. They were mostly empty, save for a few novels I'd brought with me and a handful of my old medical journals, which a mover had packed by mistake. I ran my finger along the spine of one. The New England Journal of Medicine, Vol. 348. My name was in there, listed as a contributing researcher on a paper about cellular regeneration. My mind, unbidden, pulled me back. I could smell the antiseptic scent of the lab, feel the cool, reassuring weight of a pipette in my hand. I remembered the thrill, a feeling like electricity, when an experiment finally yielded the results you had hypothesized. It was a kind of magic, coaxing secrets from the universe. I was on the cusp of something important back then, a new way of looking at how cells aged. It was my life's work. Then Robert, my husband, the brilliant, funny, kind man I thought I would grow old with, had a heart attack on his way to work and was gone. Just like that. The world collapsed. Mason was 15, Olivia 12. They were adrift, their faces pale with a grief too big for their small bodies. I looked at them and I looked at my research, at the 80-hour work weeks, the grant proposals, the endless, demanding pursuit of discovery. And I made a choice. You cannot be in two places at once. You cannot mend a broken cell under a microscope and a broken heart at your kitchen table. I chose the kitchen table. I chose my children. I packed up my lab coat, I withdrew my name from the research grant, and I came home. I told myself it wasn't a sacrifice. It was a reprioritization. It was what love required. A new memory pushed forward, sharp and painful. The front lawn of my parents' house in Connecticut, the one they left me. The scent of my mother's climbing roses, the feel of the worn stone path under my feet. It was the only home I'd ever truly known. A place of scraped knees and bedtime stories and endless summer afternoons. I sold it. I sold it to give Mason his seed money. I can still see his face when I told him, his eyes shining with ambition. You won't regret this, Mom, he'd promised, wrapping me in a hug. I'll pay you back 10 times over. I guess tonight was the first installment. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. For a wild, stupid moment, my heart leaped. An apology, a mistake. We didn't mean it, Mom, but I knew better. It was a text from Olivia. Mom, I know tonight was difficult, but this is for the best. I've scheduled the movers for next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Please have your personal things boxed up. It will make the process much smoother. No, I love you. No, are you okay? Just logistics. The cold, efficient planning of an event. I was an event. My removal was on her calendar. A to-do item to be checked off between a spin class and a client lunch. I stared at the message, at the neat, sterile words on the glowing screen. A wave of nausea washed over me. I had given up my past for them. I had sold my history for them. I had invested my entire future in them, and in return, they had given me a moving date. I walked back to the window and looked out at the city, at the millions of tiny lights. I had always believed that a mother's love was a kind of anchor, a constant, unshakable force that held a family together. But I saw now that I wasn't their anchor. I was their launch pad. And now that their rocket had soared into the stratosphere, the launch pad was being dismantled. It was, after all, just an unnecessary expense. Tuesday arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, indifferent rumble of a moving truck. 10 o'clock. On the dot. Two men in matching gray jumpsuits stood at my door, holding clipboards and wearing expressions of polite neutrality. They were professionals. They were here to dismantle a life, and they would do it with the same efficiency they would use to move a sofa. I watched them work, a ghost in the hallways of my own temporary existence. They wrapped the chrome table in blankets. They boxed the books I'd barely read. They sealed my clothes in cardboard wardrobes. A life, I've learned, is a fragile thing. It can be condensed and categorized, sealed with brown tape and labeled with a black marker. Kitchen, linens, miscellaneous. I was miscellaneous. A collection of odds and ends that no longer fit in the main display. I didn't direct them. I didn't weep. I simply sat on the single chair they left for me in the corner, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The numbness was a mercy, a thick fog that muffled the sharp edges of my reality. The drive to New Jersey was a journey in reverse. The glittering, vertical ambition of Manhattan slowly gave way to the flat, horizontal reality of the suburbs. We passed identical houses with manicured lawns, strip malls, and the quiet, orderly streets of a world that had settled down. We were heading to a place called Willow Creek Assisted Living. The brochure Olivia had left for me on the counter showed smiling seniors playing bridge and doing watercolor painting. It looked less like a home and more like a gentle, well-lit waiting room for the final departure. It smelled of lemon-scented disinfectant and something else, a faint, sweet smell of old paper and fading perfume. It was the scent of lives lived, now confined to a single room. My room was on the second floor, overlooking a manicured courtyard with a bird bath at its center. It was small, clean, and painted a calming shade of beige. It had a single bed, a small kitchenette, a built-in dresser, and a window that didn't open all the way. It was perfectly, suffocatingly safe. The first few days were a blur of beige. I unpacked the necessities, placing my few belongings into the empty drawers. I ate my meals in a communal dining room, a sea of white hair and quiet conversations I couldn't bring myself to join. I would nod, offer a small, tight-lipped smile, and retreat back to my room. The loneliness was an entirely new species here. In the city, you could be lonely in a crowd, a participant in the shared energy. Here, the loneliness was a vacuum. It was the crushing silence of a life that had run out of things to say. At night, it was the worst. The fog of numbness would begin to burn off and the pain would rush in. I would lie in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and the questions would come, relentless and cruel. Was this it? Was this the reward for a lifetime of love and sacrifice? Did I erase myself so completely that there was nothing left for even me to find? I thought of my lab, of the person I might have become. I thought of Robert, and for the first time, I felt a pang of anger at him for leaving me alone to face this. Then the guilt would wash over me, and the tears would finally come. Silent, hot tears that soaked my pillow and offered no relief. I was at the bottom of a well, and I had forgotten how to look up. A week into my new life, a letter arrived, forwarded from my old address. It was from Secure Space Storage, a final notice that the bill for unit hash 247 was overdue. My heart sank. It was the last loose end, a 10 by 10-foot metal box holding the final remnants of the life I'd shared with Robert, the things that hadn't fit in my children's world or my new, smaller one. I had to clear it out. The bus ride to the facility was long and tedious. The storage complex sat in a desolate area by the highway, a soulless grid of identical metal doors under the harsh afternoon sun. I found my unit at the end of a long, echoing corridor. The lock was stiff and rusted. It took all my strength to roll up the heavy metal door, which shrieked in protest. A wave of musty, stagnant air hit me, the smell of forgotten time. Inside, boxes were stacked precariously, furniture was draped in dusty white sheets, and a profound sense of sadness hung in the air. This was the graveyard of my past. I had come to bury it for good. I worked methodically, my grief turning into a grim determination. I created 3 piles: trash, donate, and a small, pathetic pile of things I couldn't yet bear to part with: old photo albums, Robert's collection of poetry books, a box of Olivia's childhood drawings. With each item I discarded, I felt a piece of myself being thrown away too. It was both painful and liberating. Hours passed. My back ached and my hands were black with grime. I was down to the last stack of boxes in the back corner, and that's when I saw it. It was a simple banker's box, sagging under the weight of others, the word research scrawled on the side in my own handwriting from a lifetime ago. My first instinct was to add it to the trash pile. It represented everything I had given up, a painful reminder of a path not taken. What was the point of keeping it? It was just paper. It was just a ghost. I reached for it, intending to haul it away. But as my fingers touched the dusty cardboard, something stopped me. A faint, forgotten feeling, a flicker of electricity. It was the woman I used to be, the curious, driven scientist, whispering from across the years. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the box. The world outside, my lonely room, my absent children, it all faded away for a moment. There was only me and this box, this time capsule from a life I thought was buried forever. I pulled it from the stack, set it down in a patch of sunlight slanting through the open door, and blew a layer of dust from its lid. For a long moment, I just stood there in the doorway of the storage unit, the harsh sunlight at my back casting a long shadow over the box at my feet. A part of me, the tired, wounded part, wanted to shove the door closed and walk away. To leave that piece of my past to be auctioned off to a stranger or, more likely, hauled to a landfill. It would be a final act of surrender, a complete erasure. It would be easy. But something else held me fast. A stubborn, quiet rebellion flickered to life in my chest. They had taken my home, my money, and my future. This box, this was mine. It contained a part of me that had nothing to do with being a wife or a mother. It was the bedrock, the original foundation, before I had built my life on top of it for everyone else. With a grunt, I heaved the heavy box into my arms and carried it out into the unforgiving light. The box sat in the corner of my new beige room for 3 days. It was an accusation, a dusty, cardboard monument to a life I'd abandoned. I ignored it, busying myself with the pointless routines of Willow Creek, the bland meals in the dining hall, the slow, aimless walks around the manicured courtyard, the forced, polite conversations about the weather and grandchildren. I was trying, I think, to become the person my children wanted me to be. A quiet, simple, elderly woman with no complicated past. But the past is never as simple as we hope. It has a way of seeping through the cracks, and my past was sitting in a box in the corner. It was the fourth night, long after the sterile hallways had gone dark and silent, that I finally gave in. Sleep was a country I could no longer visit, its borders closed to me. The silence in the room was a physical weight pressing down on me. I got up, switched on the small lamp by my bed, and knelt on the floor. With trembling fingers, I broke the old tape and lifted the flaps of the box. The smell that rose to meet me was the scent of my own history: old paper, dried ink, and the faint, metallic aroma of the library at my old university. I pulled out the folders one by one. They were filled with dense, esoteric things: charts of protein folding patterns, complex chemical diagrams, and pages upon pages of my own cramped, meticulous handwriting. At first, reading them was like trying to listen to a song in a language I'd forgotten. The terms were familiar, but the fluency was gone. But slowly, as the hours passed, it began to come back. I remembered the fierce joy of the chase, the intellectual hunger that had once defined me. I remembered the woman who could spend 18 hours straight in a lab, fueled by nothing but coffee and the thrill of a potential breakthrough. A ghost of her sat with me on the floor of that beige room, and I was grateful for her company. I was deep into a folder labeled Theoretical Models Unfinished when I found it. It was a section of about 20 pages, detailing a predictive algorithm I had been developing, my private passion project. The goal was audacious: to create a mathematical model that could predict, with a high degree of accuracy, how specific drug compounds would interact with rogue proteins in the human body. It was a potential key to developing hyper-targeted medicines, to stopping diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's before they even truly began. I called it the Reed Cascade Model in my notes, a slightly arrogant title only a younger version of myself could have come up with. A sad smile touched my lips. I had been so full of fire then. A phrase from that awful dinner at the summit surfaced in my memory. Mason boasting about his company. "It's a revolutionary diagnostic tool," he had said. "Our AI can predict latent disease markers years in advance." The connection was faint, a whisper. I tried to dismiss it. It was a coincidence. My work was purely theoretical, a forgotten dream on a dusty piece of paper. His was a multi-million-dollar tech empire. But the whisper grew louder. The nagging feeling wouldn't leave. I needed to see. Willow Creek had a business center, which was really just a small, windowless room with two outdated desktop computers for the residents to use. The next morning, I sat down at one of the humming, beige towers. The internet connection was painfully slow. I felt a million miles away from the sleek, lightning-fast world my children inhabited. I typed Aura Health Technology into the search bar. Link after link appeared: tech articles from Wired and Forbes, press releases, an interview with Mason where he was hailed as a visionary. I clicked on an article titled, "The Genius Behind Aura Health's Predictive AI." It described the company's core technology in glowing, jargon-filled terms. Utilizing a proprietary cascade algorithm, the system cross-references patient data against a matrix of protein interactions to flag anomalies. My blood ran cold. Cascade algorithm. Matrix of protein interactions. It was marketing language, but I could see the scientific skeleton beneath it. I could see the bones of my own work. With shaking hands, I pulled one of the folders from the tote bag I'd brought with me. I opened it to the pages detailing the Reed Cascade model. I looked from my own hand-drawn charts and scrawled equations to the slick corporate graphics on the screen. They were the same, not similar, not inspired by. They were the same. He had taken my theoretical framework, my unfinished symphony, and he had built his entire world upon it. He hadn't just taken my money, the money I scraped together from the sale of my parents' home and the ashes of my retirement. He had taken the one thing that was uniquely mine. He had taken my mind. I sat there in the silence of that sad little computer room, the hum of the old machine filling my ears. The world outside, the chirping birds in the courtyard, the drone of a lawnmower, it all ceased to exist. There was only the screen in front of me and the 20-year-old papers in my lap. Proof, irrefutable, dated, notarized proof. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it was almost elegant in its cruelty. A masterpiece of theft painted on the canvas of a mother's love. I thought I had no tears left to cry, but I was wrong. The tears that welled in my eyes now were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of ice. I walked back to my room from the business center, but I was not the same woman who had walked out of it an hour earlier. Something had fundamentally shifted in my chemical makeup. Grief, I've discovered, is a heavy, slow-moving element. It's laid. It weighs you down, sinks you to the bottom of a cold, dark sea. What I felt now was different. It was light. It was sharp. It was radium. It burned with a cold, clear fire, and it was beginning to glow in the dark. The beige walls of my room no longer seemed sad. They seemed insulting. The polite, quiet routine of Willow Creek was no longer a gentle sentence. It was a cage I had to escape. I looked at the framed photo of Mason and Olivia on my bedside table, the one from Olivia's college graduation. They were smiling, arms around me. I had loved that picture. Now it looked like a photograph of my own executioners, smiling at their work. I turned it face down. The weeping was over. You cannot mourn a loss when you discover it was, in fact, a theft. The victim inside of me, the grieving mother who had spent weeks drowning in her own sorrow, had finally gone silent. In her place, the scientist had awoken, and the scientist did not weep. She observed, she analyzed, she formulated a hypothesis, and then she designed an experiment. My experiment began the next day at the Morris County Public Library. It was a proper library, a vast, quiet cathedral of knowledge, a world away from the sad little computer room at Willow Creek. I took the bus, a journey that felt like a pilgrimage. Surrounded by the scent of old books and the focused silence of students and researchers, I felt a part of my own soul click back into place. I wasn't a resident of a senior home. I was a researcher in her natural habitat. I didn't start with my children. I started with the law. For 3 days, I became a student again. I sat in a carrel from morning until the librarians began turning off the lights. I devoured texts on intellectual property, patent law, and corporate litigation. I learned the language of my enemy: tortious interference, breach of fiduciary duty, copyright infringement. The words were a kind of armor, a new vocabulary for the war I was about to wage. The more I read, the more the cold fire inside me burned brighter. My son had been careless. He had been arrogant. He had assumed the person he stole from was gone forever, buried under 2 decades of motherhood. He never imagined that she might just pick up a shovel and dig herself out. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. I needed a weapon, and more than that, I needed someone who knew how to wield it. On the fourth day, as I was reading a particularly dense case file, a name from my past surfaced in my mind. David Chen. We had been in the same doctoral program, friendly rivals who pushed each other to be better. David was brilliant, sharp as a scalpel, with a relentless drive I had always admired. While I had left the field, I knew David had soared. A quick search on the library computer confirmed it. He was now Dr. David Chen, a senior partner at a top patent law firm in Washington, D.C. His online bio was formidable, listing a string of high-profile, landmark cases he had won. Making that call was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. It meant admitting the full, humiliating scope of my failure. It meant reaching back into a world where I had once been his peer and revealing that I was now a destitute old woman living in a retirement home, betrayed by her own children. I sat in my carrel for an hour, my hand hovering over my cheap prepaid phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. Finally, I took a deep breath and dialed. His secretary put me through immediately when I said my name. Evelyn. David's voice came over the line, unchanged by the years, warm, sharp, and full of energy. Evelyn Reed, my God, is it really you? It must be 20 years. It's me, David, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. How are you? Where are you? Last I heard you were, well, I didn't know what I heard. It's a long story, I said. The reason I'm calling, David, it's professional. I have a rather complex intellectual property situation. A pause. Okay, he said, his tone shifting, the friendly warmth replaced by a lawyer's focused curiosity. Tell me. I laid it out for him, not with emotion, but with facts. I spoke as a scientist presenting her findings. I told him about my unfinished research on the predictive cascade model. I told him about my son's company, Aura Health. I told him about the acquisition and the technology they claimed as their own. I didn't mention the money I'd given them or where I was living. I kept it clean, a simple matter of intellectual theft. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Evelyn, he finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. Are you sure about this? I'm looking at my notarized research notes from 1999 as we speak, David. I'm looking at their public tech prospectus. They are identical. My God, he breathed. Can you send them to me, the notes, whatever you have? I can, I said, the irony tasting like ash in my mouth. I'll have to fax them from the business center here. He didn't ask where here was. He just gave me the secure fax number. Send it. I'll call you back as soon as I've reviewed it. An hour later, my little phone buzzed. It was David. His voice was different now. The warmth was gone, the curiosity was gone. It had been replaced by something harder, colder, the sound of a weapon being unsheathed. I've got them, Evelyn, he said. I've spent the last hour with two of my top associates. We've cross-referenced everything with Aura's public filings. He took a deep, deliberate breath. So, I whispered, do I have a case? David let out a short, mirthless laugh. A case? Evelyn, you don't have a case. You have a coronation. What your son did wasn't just theft. It was the dumbest, most arrogant act of corporate malpractice I have ever seen. He paused, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his brilliant mind. Evelyn, they didn't just steal a blueprint. They built a $200 million glass skyscraper on your land. And you, my friend, are not holding a rock. You're holding the deed to the entire goddamn fault line it's sitting on. David's words hung in the air long after our call ended. A fault line, that's what he'd said. For the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath my feet solidify. I had been adrift in a sea of grief, but now I had found land. It was not a safe harbor, not yet. It was volcanic rock, still hot to the touch, but it was real. It was mine. The next morning, the beige room at Willow Creek was no longer a prison cell. It had become a command center. The war I was about to wage would not be fought with shouting or tears. It would be fought with paper and precision, with the cold, irrefutable logic of the law. It would be fought like an experiment. Our strategy sessions took place over a series of calls on my cheap, prepaid phone, David's voice crackling with energy from his sleek D.C. office became my lifeline to a world I thought I'd lost forever. The conventional route is simple, he explained on our second call, his lawyer brain already working at high speed. We file an injunction and a lawsuit for intellectual property theft, copyright infringement, and unjust enrichment. We'll sue Mason, his company, the whole lot. Given your evidence, we'll settle out of court. You'll be a very, very wealthy woman, Evelyn. You'll never have to worry about anything again. I listened, letting the words wash over me. A few weeks ago, that would have sounded like a dream, a golden ticket out of my beige nightmare, but something had changed inside me. The scientist had fully taken the reins, and she wasn't interested in a simple payout. It's not about the money, David, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Not anymore. Money is what they used to measure my worth and then to discard me. If I only take their money, I'm still playing their game. I paused, looking at the faded research papers spread across my single bed. They didn't just steal a formula, they stole my name. They stole my life's work and tried to convince me I had no value without them. I don't want their money, David. I want my work back. I want them to know that I am the source. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him recalibrating, reassessing the woman he thought he was talking to. When he finally spoke, the respect in his voice was palpable. All right, Evelyn, he said slowly. So we're not looking for a settlement, we're looking for a checkmate. Exactly, I whispered. And so, the real plan began to take shape. It was a beautiful thing, elegant in its design and ruthless in its potential execution. David, energized by the challenge, called it the ghost in the machine. Step one was to secure the intellectual property. David's team worked around the clock, preparing and filing a fast-track patent application for the Reed Cascade model. My old notes, meticulously dated and witnessed by a former university colleague, were our gospel. They were a time-stamped, undeniable record of prior invention that would be nearly impossible to refute. Step two was to create the ghost. We can't have Dr. Evelyn Reed, his mother, be the face of this, not yet, David had insisted. They'll frame it as a messy family squabble, a scorned mother seeking revenge. The media would have a field day. We need this to be cold, corporate, and terrifying. So, he formed a shell corporation, a limited liability company registered in Delaware for maximum anonymity. He asked me what I wanted to call it. I thought for a moment and said, let's call it Phoenix Labs, LLC. The irony was for me alone. Step three, the most crucial, was choosing our target. We would not go after Mason. That would be like attacking a knight on the chessboard. We would go after the king, or in this case, the entity with the most to lose, North Star Pharmaceuticals, the multi-billion-dollar corporation on the verge of acquiring Aura Health. Their due diligence team has failed spectacularly, David explained, a note of clinical glee in his voice. They're about to spend $200 million on a company whose core asset is built on stolen property. If we inform them first, we don't create a family drama. We create a corporate crisis. The deal will be frozen, and Mason will be caught in the crossfire, squeezed from all sides. My days fell into a new rhythm. I was a quiet resident of Willow Creek by day, nodding to my neighbors and picking at my food in the dining hall. But by night, my room was aglow with the light of my laptop, a cheap one I'd bought with the last of my cash. I became a ghost myself, haunting the online archives of the Securities and Exchange Commission, reading through North Star's quarterly reports, learning the names of their board members, their lawyers, their corporate structure. I was no longer a mother grieving her children. I was a strategist profiling her opponent. Are you sure you don't want to come to D.C.? David asked one evening. We can put you up in a hotel. You'd be more comfortable. We could work from a proper war room. I looked around my small, beige room. The research papers were neatly stacked on the desk. The LLC formation documents were in a folder by my bed. This wasn't a room in a retirement home anymore. It was my fortress. No, David, I replied. I'm exactly where I need to be. In their minds, I'm here, a harmless old woman, quietly fading away in New Jersey. Let them believe that. The most powerful weapon we have right now is their complete and utter ignorance. They don't even know we're on the board. A week later, David called. His voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of excitement. It's done, he said. The patent application is filed and has been granted priority review based on the evidence. Phoenix Labs is a registered legal entity. The official notice to North Star's general counsel is drafted and ready to send. He paused. We are ready to light the fuse, Evelyn. I just need you to say the word. I stood up and walked to my window, looking down at the quiet, manicured courtyard. A few residents were sitting by the bird bath, their faces turned towards the last rays of the afternoon sun. It was all so peaceful, so orderly. A world built on the assumption that things would proceed as expected. The word, I said into the phone, my voice even and clear, is begin. There are moments in life that should be loud, that you expect to arrive with a crash of cymbals and a roll of drums. The beginning of a war ought to be one of them. But my war began with a quiet click on a telephone line, the sound of David hanging up in his office 200 miles away. The world did not shake. The beige walls of my room did not tremble. Outside my window, a groundskeeper continued to methodically trim the hedges. And yet, I knew. A single invisible, digital signal had been sent. The fuse had been lit. All that was left to do was wait for the sound of the explosion. Waiting, I have come to believe, is its own special kind of torment. It's a quiet, humming anxiety that settles deep in your bones. For the next 4 days, I lived my life at Willow Creek as if nothing had changed. I ate the mushy green beans in the dining hall. I exchanged pleasantries about the weather with a woman named Doris who always wore too much lavender perfume. I returned my library books on time. I played the part of Evelyn Reed, quiet resident, forgotten mother. But beneath that placid surface, a storm was raging. Every hour, I would make my way to the sad little business center, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and I would check the financial news. Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters. Nothing. The silence was deafening. Had they received it? Was it dismissed as a crank letter? Did they laugh, shred it, and move on? The doubt was a corrosive acid, eating away at the edges of my newfound resolve. I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, if I was just a lonely old woman creating a fantasy of revenge to survive the crushing reality of her life. On the fifth day, I found it. It wasn't a headline. It was a footnote, a small, unassuming paragraph buried deep in a market analysis column on the Financial Times website. I almost scrolled right past it. The title of the article was Pharmaceutical Sector Sees Q3 Consolidation. But there, halfway down, was the sentence that made my breath catch in my chest. In related news, the much-anticipated acquisition of biotech startup Aura Health by North Star Pharmaceuticals has reportedly been delayed. Sources close to the deal cite unforeseen complexities during the final due diligence phase, with whispers of a significant third-party intellectual property claim. North Star's stock dipped a fraction of a point on the news before stabilizing. A spokesperson for Aura Health declined to comment. I read the paragraph 3 times, then I printed it. I folded the warm piece of paper and put it in my pocket where it felt like a hot stone. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. Unforeseen complexities. Third-party intellectual property claim. It was the quiet, sterile language of corporate panic. The bomb had gone off, not in a fiery explosion, but in a silent, seismic shockwave that was now rattling the highest floors of power in New York City. And I, from a shared computer in a New Jersey retirement home, had been the one to press the button. There is a power in being underestimated. My children, in their glittering world of suits and skyscrapers, saw power as something loud, a booming voice in a boardroom, an expensive car, a headline in a magazine. They never understood the other kind of power, the quiet power of the forgotten, the power of the person no one is watching, the person who has nothing left to lose. It's the power of the ghost in the machine. I walked back to my room, the piece of paper in my pocket a secret source of strength. The world looked different. The beige walls seemed less like a prison and more like a clever disguise. I had caused a tremor in their universe, and they had no idea where it had come from. That evening, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was Olivia. It was the first time she had called me since that night at the summit. My heart gave a single, hard thud. I took a breath, letting the calm, methodical scientist take over. I smoothed my voice, arranging it into the familiar, gentle tones of the mother she thought she knew. Then I answered. Hello, honey. Mom? Her voice was thin, frayed, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Mom, are you there? Of course, Olivia. Is everything all right? You sound upset. A choked, frantic sound came from the other end. No, I don't know. Something's wrong. It's the deal, the North Star deal. It's on hold. On hold? I injected a note of gentle confusion into my voice. What do you mean? I thought it was all settled. It was supposed to be, but the lawyers called this morning. They're going crazy. North Star is putting everything on ice. Mason is, Mom, you should see him. He's losing his mind. He's screaming at everyone. She was rambling now, the words tumbling out in a rush of panic. They keep talking about some claim, a patent issue, like someone else is saying they own the tech, but that's impossible. Mason built it from the ground up. I clutched the phone, my knuckles white. My son who built it from the ground up. The lie was so ingrained, she spoke it as gospel. Oh, honey, that sounds just awful, I said, my voice dripping with the fake, useless sympathy she had once offered me. A patent claim? That sounds so complicated. Is there anything I can do? No, she sniffled. I don't think so. I didn't know who else to call. The words hung in the air. I didn't know who else to call. The daughter who had outsourced her mother to a budget facility was now seeking comfort from that same mother. The irony was a bitter pill. Well, you know I'm always here for you, sweetie, I said softly. I'm sure it's just some kind of misunderstanding. These things happen in business. Your brother is so smart. He'll figure it out. We spoke for another minute, a pointless exchange of reassurances from me and panicked fragments from her. When we hung up, I sat in the silence of my room for a long time. The first ripple had reached the shore. She had called me for comfort, looking for the soft, forgiving mother she had discarded. She had no idea she was actually speaking to the storm. There's a strange intimacy in listening to the panic of someone whose heart you are deliberately breaking. As Olivia's frantic, frightened voice filled my small room, I felt a profound and unsettling calm. The mother in me, the one who would have once moved heaven and earth to soothe her daughter's fears, was silent. She had been replaced by a colder, more patient observer. I was no longer a participant in their lives. I was a force of nature acting upon them. I was the low-pressure system, sitting quietly offshore, watching the barometers begin to fall on the mainland. The days that followed Olivia's call were filled with a tense, vibrating silence from my end, and what I could only imagine was escalating chaos on hers. I did not have to see it to know it. I knew my son. Mason's arrogance was a shield, but it was a brittle one. He would not react to this crisis with introspection or caution. He would react with rage. He would look for an enemy to attack, a rival to blame, a subordinate to fire. His world was built on the simple belief in his own genius. The idea that this genius was not his own would be a concept so alien, his mind would refuse to process it. They're in full panic mode, David reported to me a few days later, his voice sharp with satisfaction. North Star has put a battalion of lawyers on this. They've formally halted the acquisition pending a full review of Aura's intellectual property rights. They're demanding answers, and your son doesn't have any. What's our next move? I asked, looking out my window at the unchanging courtyard. We let them sweat for another 48 hours, David said. Then we turn up the heat. We're going to send a second notice. This one goes directly to Aura Health's legal counsel. And this time, we're going to give the ghost a name. I knew what he meant. We were going to give them the name of my research, the Reed Cascade model. A name that would mean nothing to the lawyers, but would, I hoped, be a poison dart aimed directly at the heart of my daughter's memory. I spent the next 2 days imagining the storm I had unleashed. I could see Mason in his glass-walled office, pacing like a caged panther, his jaw tight, his expensive suit feeling like a straitjacket. I could hear his voice, a clipped, angry bark on the phone to his own attorneys. Find them, I don't care what it costs. This is corporate espionage. A shakedown, someone is trying to tank my deal, and I want to know who. And I could see Olivia, sitting in on those frantic meetings, her face pale, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. She would be trying to be the supportive sister, the savvy marketing partner. But a seed of doubt had been planted. She had been there in the background of my life during those years of research. Had she ever heard me mention my work? Had a phrase, a name, a concept stuck in the deep, unvisited attic of her memory? The second letter was sent on a Thursday. It was, David assured me, a masterpiece of polite, legal menace. It detailed, without revealing the plaintiff's identity, the specific nature of the claim, citing the original research title, a predictive cascade model for protein interaction, and the years it was developed. If the first letter was a tremor, this was the earthquake. The call came on Friday night. It was Olivia again. This time, there was no pretense of asking for comfort. Her voice was a strained whisper, tight with a new kind of fear. "Mom," she said, the word barely audible. "They sent another letter to our lawyers." "Oh dear," I said, my voice a perfect mimicry of maternal concern. "It had a name in it, the name of the research they're claiming is theirs." She took a shaky breath. "Mom, I think I remember that name from a long time ago. On your whiteboard in your old study at the house, the read something." I stayed silent. The silence was a hook, and I let her wriggle on it. "I asked Mason about it," she continued, her voice dropping even lower as if she were afraid of being overheard. "He got so angry. He said I was being ridiculous, that you were just a lab tech, that you wouldn't even understand this kind of science. He scared me, Mom." "Your brother is under a lot of pressure, honey," I said softly. "No, this was different," she insisted, a frantic edge in her voice. "This was desperate. He's not sleeping. He's yelling at everyone. He's hired some private investigator to find out who is behind a company called Phoenix Labs. My heart gave a little skip, a beat of triumph. He was chasing the ghost. He suspects everyone, Olivia whispered. Our biggest competitor, a former programmer we fired last year, he even asked me if I had done something to sabotage him. The last words came out on a wave of disbelief and hurt. The cracks in their foundation were becoming fissures. The united front was crumbling. I'm so sorry you're going through this, Olivia, I said, and to my surprise, a small, genuine part of me meant it. Not for the loss of their money, but for the violent destruction of her illusions. It is a painful thing to learn that the person you have followed and trusted is a fraud. We ended the call soon after. I sat in the gathering dusk of my room, the phone silent in my lap. The storm was no longer gathering. It had made landfall. Mason, in his blind arrogance, was tearing his own kingdom apart, looking for an enemy on the outside, never once thinking to look within his own family, at his own history. He was hunting for a powerful, faceless corporation, a rival king on the chessboard. He had no idea his opponent was a quiet woman in a beige room, a queen he had mistaken for a pawn long ago, and she was patiently waiting for him to make his next foolish move. In chess, there is a moment, long before the king is actually toppled, when the game is already over. It's the moment when one player sees the inevitable chain of moves, the elegant, inescapable trap they have laid, and the other player is still blissfully unaware, moving their pieces around a board that has already become their prison. My son, the self-proclaimed king of his own small universe, had just been maneuvered into checkmate. He just didn't know it yet. The summons came on a Monday morning, a call from David. His voice was laced with the grim excitement of a general on the eve of a decisive battle. They've blinked, Evelyn. North Star's legal team is demanding a face-to-face. They want to meet with the principal of Phoenix Labs to resolve this, or they walk. And they've made it clear that if they walk, they're coming after Aura with a lawsuit that will burn it to the ground. When? I asked, my own voice a calm counterpoint to his energy. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., their law firm's headquarters, Midtown Manhattan. He paused. This is it, Evelyn. Are you ready? I looked at my reflection in the dark window of my room, a woman with gray streaks in her hair and a story in her eyes that no one had ever bothered to read. I've been ready for 20 years, David, I said. That morning, I did not dress as a mother. I did not dress as a resident of Willow Creek. I dressed as a scientist, as a founder, as the sole principal of Phoenix Labs. I wore a charcoal gray suit, impeccably tailored, that I had ordered online and had delivered to a post office box. It was my armor. With it, I wore a simple silk blouse the color of steel and a quiet confidence that was more formidable than any weapon. The journey into Manhattan was the reverse of the one I had taken weeks earlier in the back of a moving truck. This time, I was not being exiled. I was returning to reclaim my kingdom. David met me in the lobby of the law firm, a towering monolith of glass and granite on Park Avenue. He looked at me, a long, appraising look, and a slow smile spread across his face. Dr. Reed, he said with a respectful nod. It's good to have you back. The meeting was on the 54th floor in a boardroom that was larger than my entire apartment. A vast mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the cold, gray sky outside. At one end sat three stone-faced lawyers from North Star Pharmaceuticals, their portfolios arranged in a neat, hostile row. And across from them sat Mason and Olivia. My son was a coiled spring of rage and indignation. He was dressed in his usual armor of success, but it looked ill-fitting today. There were dark circles under his eyes, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. Olivia was a ghost. Pale and drawn, she sat slightly behind her brother, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table. Then the door opened. David and I walked in. Time seemed to slow down. Every head in the room turned. The North Star lawyers looked on with cool, professional curiosity. Mason's face, however, was a kaleidoscope of emotions. First, confusion. What is the old woman from the retirement home doing here? Then, dawning, sickening horror as he saw the look in my eyes, the suit I was wearing, the man who stood beside me. Finally, it settled into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Olivia just stared, her lips parted in a silent, devastated gasp. The terrible suspicion she had been nursing for days had just materialized in front of her, dressed in charcoal gray. "What is this?" Mason finally exploded, his voice echoing in the vast, silent room. He shot to his feet. "What the hell is she doing here? This is a joke, a sick, pathetic joke." He turned his glare on David. "You put her up to this, didn't you? You're preying on an old woman to try and get a payday." David didn't flinch. He calmly placed his briefcase on the table and looked at Mason as if he were a mildly interesting insect. "Mr. Reed, please be seated," he said, his voice cutting through Mason's tirade like a surgeon's scalpel. "Your mother is here today in her capacity as the sole founder and principal of Phoenix Labs, LLC, the legal entity which holds the patent to the core technology you have for the past 5 years, fraudulently represented as your own." The room was silent save for the sound of Mason's ragged breathing. He sank back into his chair, stunned. The lead counsel for North Star, a severe-looking woman named MS. Albright, cleared her throat. "Dr. Chen," she said, addressing David but looking at me, "we are here to understand the nature and validity of your client's claim." "Of course," David said. He opened his briefcase, but before he could speak, I raised a hand. "If I may," I said. All eyes turned to me. My voice was even, calm, the voice of a lecturer, not a victim. I did not look at my children. I looked at MS Albright. In the autumn of 1999, while working as a biomedical researcher, I began developing a theoretical model, a predictive algorithm designed to map the complex cascade of protein interactions that can lead to neurodegenerative diseases. My work was novel. It was also, unfortunately, interrupted. I let that hang in the air for a moment. I kept my notes, of course, detailed, dated, and witnessed, as any scientist would. I looked down the long table at Mason, my eyes meeting his for the first time. The fury in his gaze was now mixed with a new, unfamiliar emotion. Fear. The model, I continued, turning my attention back to the lawyers, was called the Reed Cascade model. It is the exact intellectual framework that your prospective acquisition, or a health, refers to in its prospectus as its proprietary diagnostic AI. They simply changed the name. David chose that moment to slide a thick, bound folder across the table. It landed in front of MS Albright with a quiet, definitive thud. "You'll find Dr. Reed's original research, along with the official patent filing from Phoenix Labs, in there," he said calmly. MS Albright opened the folder. The other lawyers leaned in. They scanned the pages, their faces impassive masks, but I saw the slight widening of their eyes, the subtle tightening of their lips. They were seeing the dates. They were seeing the detailed scientific proof. They were seeing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit blooming in front of their very eyes. "This is insane." Mason finally managed to choke out, his voice hoarse. She gave me those ideas. Years ago, it was just talk, dinner table conversations." I looked at him, a profound, weary sadness washing over me. Even now, he had to frame it as his own. "Mason," I said, my voice soft but carrying across the silent room, "I haven't had a dinner table conversation with you about cellular biology since you were a teenager. You took my work from a box in a storage unit you thought I'd forgotten. You took it because you were failing and you needed a lifeline." MS Albright closed the folder. The sound was like a gavel falling. She ignored my son's pale, trembling face completely. She looked directly at me. "Dr. Reed," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of all emotion, "your documentation appears to be comprehensive." She then turned her cold, assessing gaze upon Mason. "Mr. Reed," she said, "it appears we have a very serious problem." MS Albright's words landed on the polished mahogany table with the weight of a judge's gavel. A very serious problem. In the language of corporate law, this was the equivalent of a death sentence. It was the end. The silence that followed was a living thing, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered all the air in the room. In that silence, I watched my son's face. You learn a lot about a person not when they are winning, but when they have irrefutably lost. I saw the blood drain from his cheeks, leaving behind a waxy, gray pallor. I saw the confident architecture of his arrogance collapse inward, leaving only the rotted, terrified frame of a little boy who had been caught. But there was no remorse in his eyes. only the wild, cornered fury of a predator who cannot comprehend being trapped. He turned his gaze on me, and the hatred in it was so pure, so potent, it was almost beautiful in its awfulness. You, he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. You did this. You couldn't bear to see me succeed. You were always jealous. A bitter old woman sitting in a dusty lab, and you couldn't stand that I built something real? MS Albright shifted in her chair, a clear signal of her impatience with this family drama. She addressed David, pointedly ignoring my son. Dr. Chen, our agreement was with Aura Health under the assumption that Mr. Reed was its legitimate principal. Clearly, that is no longer the case. The acquisition is terminated, effective immediately. We will, however, be in touch regarding North Star's options for pursuing damages against Mr. Reed for fraudulent misrepresentation. She then looked at me. Dr. Reed, should your entity Phoenix Labs wish to open a separate line of discussion, my office is available. It was a corporate execution, swift and bloodless. In the space of 30 seconds, she had erased Mason from the equation and anointed me as the new power in the room. That was what finally broke him. No, he roared, slamming his hands on the table, a sound that made Olivia jump in her skin. You don't get to do this. I built it. It was my work, my sweat. She was nothing. He rounded on his sister, his face contorted in a mask of rage. And you just sat there. You knew she was up to something. You let her do this to us, to me. It was the last, desperate act of a dying king, to burn his own kingdom down around him. He had become a caricature of his own ambition, a screaming, entitled child in a $2,000 suit. I think this meeting is over, David said calmly. He gave a subtle nod to a man standing by the door, and a moment later, two security guards entered the room. They didn't touch Mason, but their presence was a clear, unspoken message. My son looked from the guards to me, his chest heaving. There was no apology in his eyes, no flicker of regret, only a promise of endless, bottomless hate. He snatched his briefcase, shot one last, venomous look at his sister, and stormed out of the room. The heavy door swung shut behind him, leaving a profound, vibrating silence in his wake. The empire was fallen. The tyrant was deposed, and all that was left were the ruins. MS Albright and her team gathered their papers with brisk, unsentimental efficiency. They offered me and David a curt, professional nod, and then they too were gone. The boardroom, which had felt so charged and crowded just minutes before, was now a vast, empty cavern. All that remained was me, David, and the hunched, weeping figure of my daughter. David came over and gently squeezed my shoulder. I'll wait for you in the lobby, he said, a quiet act of immense kindness. He understood that this next part was not for a lawyer to witness. I walked slowly to the other end of the table and sat down in the chair next to Olivia. She didn't look up. Her shoulders shook with ragged, silent sobs. For a long time, the only sound was her weeping. I did not reach out to comfort her. Comfort was a currency I was no longer willing to spend so freely. I'm sorry, she finally whispered, the words muffled by her hands. Mom, I'm so sorry. Sorry for what exactly, Olivia? I asked, my voice not unkind, but not soft either. It was the voice of a scientist asking for precise data. She looked up, her face a mess of tears and smeared makeup. For all of it for that night, for not seeing. You saw, Olivia, I said gently. Don't lie to yourself, not anymore. You saw, you just chose not to look. Her face crumpled and a fresh wave of sobs shook her body. I know, she cried. I know it was easier. The money, the success, living in his world was so much easier than asking the right questions. I knew about your research. I remembered, and I said nothing. I stood there in that restaurant and let him throw you away like you were garbage, and I said nothing. This was it. The truth, not an excuse, but a confession. It was the ugliest, most honest thing she had ever said to me. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. What can I do? She whispered. Please tell me how to fix this. I thought for a long moment, looking at the broken young woman in front of me. The mother in me wanted to pull her into my arms and tell her it would all be okay. But the woman I had become, the woman who had clawed her way out of a beige-colored grave, knew that would be a lie. You can't fix what you've broken, Olivia, I said, my voice soft but unyielding. The past is a fixed point. All you can do is build something new, and you have to build it on a foundation of truth. I stood up. Your entire life, you've been Mason's sister or my daughter. You've defined yourself by the men in your life, your father, your brother. You don't even know who you are without them. I walked toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the silence. So that's what you can do, I said, turning back to look at her one last time. Go find out who Olivia Reed is. Not the marketing expert, not the CEO's sister, not the woman who wears designer dresses. Just Olivia. Figure out what she believes in. Figure out what she's willing to fight for instead of what she's willing to ignore. I opened the heavy door. When you have an answer to that, I said, then you can call me. And with that, I walked out, leaving my daughter alone in the silent, empty boardroom, surrounded by the wreckage of the beautiful, terrible lie she had helped to build. When you walk away from a battlefield, even as the victor, you do not feel the exhilarating rush of triumph you see in movies. You feel a profound and heavy quiet. The adrenaline fades, leaving behind an exhaustion that settles deep in your soul. As I met David in the lobby, leaving the wreckage of my family behind me on the 54th floor, I did not feel like a queen who had conquered a kingdom. I felt like a scientist who had just completed a long and painful experiment, the results of which were both conclusive and heartbreaking. What now, Evelyn? David asked gently, his eyes full of a wisdom that went beyond the law. I looked out through the vast glass doors at the ceaseless, indifferent river of humanity on Park Avenue. Now, I said, a sense of purpose beginning to stitch the ragged edges of my heart back together. Now we build. The weeks that followed were a blur of negotiations, not of war, but of creation. The lawyers at North Star Pharmaceuticals, now seeing me as a peer rather than a problem, were efficient and respectful. We were no longer adversaries. We were partners in a new venture. We restructured the deal. Aura Health was dissolved, its name forever tainted by my son's fraud. In its place, a new research division was created under North Star, centered entirely around the technology of the Reed Cascade model. As its creator, Phoenix Labs, which was to say, I, retained a majority ownership stake and a permanent seat on the oversight board. The money, when it finally arrived in a bank account that David had set up for me, was a number so large it seemed fictional. It was a tool, nothing more, a means to an end. My first act was to formally address the matter of my children. Mason refused all contact, communicating only through a single, vitriolic letter from his lawyer, accusing me of orchestrating his ruin. He saw no fault in his own actions, only in my reaction to them. There is no building on a foundation of pure, unrepentant rage. I instructed David to inform his counsel that he would receive nothing. His chapter in my life was closed. Olivia was different. As I had asked, she disappeared. 3 months after that terrible day in the boardroom, I received a long, handwritten letter. In it, she did not ask for money or forgiveness. She told me that she had left New York, that she was living in a small apartment in Philadelphia, working as a waitress. She told me she had started therapy. She told me for the first time in her life, she was trying to listen to her own voice, and that it was quiet and scared, but it was there. She wrote about her shame, her complicity, and her slow, painful journey to understanding how she had allowed herself to become a person she didn't respect. In response, I set up a modest trust in her name. It was not enough for a life of luxury, but it was enough for security. It was enough to finish her education, should she choose, or to start a small business. The trust came with conditions. She had to remain in therapy, and she had to complete 500 hours of community service at a nonprofit of her choice. It was not a reward. It was a roadmap, a chance to build the new foundation I had spoken of. With the bulk of the fortune, I did not buy a penthouse or a yacht. I bought back my dream. I established the Reed Institute for Medical Innovation, a nonprofit research foundation dedicated to funding the kind of audacious, early-stage science that I had once pursued, the kind that rarely gets corporate funding but can change the world. 6 months have passed since that day in the boardroom. My home is no longer a beige room in New Jersey. It is here, in a corner office filled with light, overlooking the gleaming new laboratories of the Institute. My desk is cluttered not with legal documents, but with research proposals and scientific journals. The air smells not of disinfectant, but of possibility. I am wearing a white lab coat. It feels more natural on my shoulders than any designer suit ever could. I walk through the corridors, the sound of my sensible shoes clicking on the polished floor, and I see the faces of the young, brilliant scientists we are funding. I see the fire and hunger in their eyes that I once saw in my own. I push open the door to one of the main labs. My daughter Olivia is sitting at a small administrative desk in the corner, organizing data sheets for a clinical trial. She works here part-time as a volunteer. It was her idea. She is quieter now, more thoughtful. The brittle, polished shield she used to carry is gone. She looks up as I enter, and a small, genuine smile touches her lips. "Hi, Mom," she says softly. "Hi, honey," I reply, my own smile coming easily. "How's the data looking?" We talk for a few minutes about the work. Our conversations are different now. They are not built on assumptions or obligations, but on a fragile, growing respect. The chasm between us has not vanished, but we have started to build a bridge, one small, honest plank at a time. I leave her to her work and walk to the large window at the end of the lab, looking out at the city. For so many years, I believed my children were my greatest creation, my life's defining work. I poured every piece of myself into them until there was nothing left of the original formula that was me. But a life, like science, is about discovery. And the greatest discovery I ever made was that it's never too late to reclaim your own research. You can find the dusty, forgotten box in the back of your mind, you can blow off the dust, and you can start the experiment again. The true victory wasn't winning the money, it was winning back the woman who had earned it. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it finds you well. There is so much strength inside each of us, more than we could ever know. I wish you all good health. And may you and your families always find happiness and truth together.